it has been 5 years since the current leadership of Ethiopia took the premiership role. This short documentary will help you to have a worthwhile glimpse of the whole lot of reforms carried out in the social, political, and economic sphere of the country. Through the political reforms, contending political parties which were in exile for many years had been summoned by the government to their country. Amnesty has been granted to political prisoners. Political space had been widened to political contestants. Female cabinets with 50+% have been given key government positioning, including the head of state of the country. National Dialogue Commission, which aimed at creating peace and reconciliation among nations, and an independent electoral board had been set up. In the arena of economic reforms, a homegrown economic strategy had been coined by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, which is mainly architected by the Plan and Development Commission of Ethiopia. The homegrown economic reform strategy is a very ambitious initiative aimed at making Ethiopia the beacon of African prosperity by 2030. Hence, to realize this revitalization of the macroeconomic imbalances and instabilities through reforming the macroeconomic indicators such as logistics and transport, tourism, mining, agriculture, import-export trade, telecom, banking sectors, among others. The sectorial reform is another area of the reform achievements. Setting up new ministries, commissions, and corporates are among the few.
In order to see the general arena, general landscape of the last 5 years in this country, I think we need to go back to the previous years of economic, social, political, and other existence of the Ethiopian people. In my view, though there were some advancements with regards to economic features, Ethiopia went through a lot of challenges which needed to be addressed by a certain kind of reform. Our people looked for better democratic spaces. Our people looked for better economic existence. Our people looked for better, lifestyles. So we can say that when we compare the last 5 years in terms of those three major perspectives that you put forward, I can say, though it needs a lot of discussion and a lot of research, in general, we could say that we are better off. We are better off. This, in terms of the economic progress, economists could say, better than me, but the figures that are coming out from the international bodies testify that Ethiopia is becoming among the top 5 economies in Africa.
The current government of Ethiopia carried out all the reforms and developments despite the stiff challenges and bottlenecks emanated from COVID-19, the northern conflict where Ethiopia had been into a lot, Russia-Ukraine war, desert locust infestation, drought resulted from global climate change, the GERD political contention, Western superpowers pressure, mainly orchestrated economic sanctions, mismatch between GDP per capita income and alarming population growth, market inflation, global economic setback, and many more.
If you go back 5 years, which is back in 2018, the first 2 years, 18, 19, the economy was actually doing well, growing, I believe, by about 6% or so, 5-6%, according to the IMF, World Bank. The Ethiopian government has a higher number, but at least there was a steady progress. But also at the same time, the new leadership realized that certain changes in course were needed in terms of the direction of the economy. If you recall, I mean, I think it's important also to have a perspective of the previous, say, 10 years. The Ethiopian economy had been one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But it had reached a point where certain things, for example, debt sustainability was becoming a big burden on the economy, so that needed to be addressed. And also, despite obviously very fast growth in the previous 10 years, there wasn't really structural changes that were needed to sustain it over the next 10 or 15 years at that pace. And we see a lot of this in a lot of emerging economies. If you look at China, if you look at Korea, at the similar stage of development, they needed to change course. And Ethiopia also needed to change course because what worked, say, for the previous 15 years wasn't going to work for the next 10, 15 years, especially, as I said, the debt burden was becoming a challenge, and also structural transformation was not really visible. There were a lot of attempts made. So 5 years ago, or at least let's say a year into the new administration, they made a decision that they needed to come up with a new set of economic policies and strategies for the next, say, X number of years. So if you recall, the Homegrown economic reform program was announced about 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago. And the key effort or focus, and this was based on presentation the government gave, the Ministry of Finance. I remember the state minister at that time, Dr. Eyob, gave a very big presentation at the Sheraton. I remember I attended that as well. And the key strategy was, one, to bring about structural transformation, not just growth, but to make sure things are changing sustainably and integrated changes in the economy, one. Second, address, as I said, the debt issue, which was becoming real burden on the economy. And third, in the way we understand it, they put pillars, 5 key pillars of priority sectors. So one would be manufacturing. The other one was, of course, the big one is agriculture, tourism, and natural resources, and ICT. So the government said these are priority pillars, sectors that the government and the country, including the private sector, should focus on, because these has very high possibilities of growth and transforming the economy.
Recently, the data that a certain institution put forward attests that, and if I am not mistaken, Ethiopia is now the leading economy in East Africa. Just surpassing Kenya, and that for itself speaks a lot. Our reserves and and our agricultural production, and the modernization of the agricultural production that we put in place also speaks for itself. Ethiopia started exporting wheat for the first time, and that speaks volumes about our economic engagements and the results we gained. In terms of democratic spaces, for instance, now there are a lot of private media operating in this country. That's one major area where you should look for while talking about political and democratization. private media mushrooming, the social media, as you see, everybody now can speak whatever they want. They can advance their political, social, and other religious, thoughts freely. So I can say this in general terms, and I feel that it's a reform. It's an ongoing process. I always see it like a work in progress. We are in a better position from the place where we have started, and that promises a better future for all Ethiopians.
Say late 2018, early 2019, but as you know, less than a year later, in early 2020, COVID hit. COVID hit the world. It's one of those events that comes in once a century, once every 2 centuries. So in the process of changing, of trying to transform the economy to its next phase, COVID affected Ethiopia like every other country in the world. And by the way, the lingering effect of COVID is still there, not just here in Ethiopia. I was in Washington a couple weeks ago. I attended a presentation by the chief economist for the World Bank for Africa, for Sub-Saharan Africa. And their main conclusion is the lingering effect on Africa's economies of COVID is still here. And in fact, it retarded Africa's growth. So within that is Ethiopia. Now, but if you look at actually, and this is what I call the resiliency of the economy, even within the impact of COVID in 2020 and up until mid-2021, actually the Ethiopian economy grew when the rest of Africa, actually for the first time Africa as a whole in 25 years was in a recession. So it showed some resiliency, but we can't be isolated from the rest of the world. So while reforms are taking place. Second, obviously the conflict, which is an internal issue of course, within our own country, started, I think it was in November 2020, then that also had, of course, an impact. So I'm trying to put a layer on each one of these things so just that you viewers understand when you ask me how do I summarize the Ethiopian economy, we have to understand the events that took place in the last, say, 3.5 years. So the conflict also, had an impact. There's no question about it. And in fact, by the government's own public announcement, the effect on the economy for the rehabilitation is that it needs about $20 billion over the next 5 years to do the rehabilitation. $20 billion US. That's a pretty significant. But the economy still grew. Now, not to the extent that it was doing previously, but it continued to grow. Okay? Now, to be honest with you, and if you were to put a hypothetical assumption of factoring all this COVID and the conflict, and then the third component, which I will add now, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict exactly a year ago, you would have thought the economy would completely collapse. Actually, you would have thought the whole state would collapse. It didn't. So the one conclusion you can reach is there's resiliency in the country, resilient people, and resilient economy, right? So where we are today is on the uptake. It still has, the economy is still impacted by a number of factors. As I said, last year oil was at $120 a barrel. That brought a lot of imported inflation, compounded with the domestic challenges. So that needs to be addressed, and I know the government is working on addressing the challenge of inflation in a holistic way, okay? So inflation continues to be a challenge. There's no question about it. Okay. It's at about 35%. Very elevated. Now, I also want to put that in context though. The previous 15 years, because in my view, high inflation is structural in Ethiopia. That means it needs a structural strategy to address it. The previous 15 years, it was 15%. That's still very high. So that, I think, needs to be factored in. Whoever is discussing Ethiopia's economy needs to really address the impact of inflation. Because, by the way, the reason we want to focus on inflation is its biggest impact is low-income earners, people on fixed income, okay? Not high earners, wealthy Ethiopians. So it affects the middle class, the lower class, and people on fixed income. So that needs to be addressed, okay? But going back to my earlier point, though, about the growth, so it's a resilient economy. Part of the reason is because the fundamentals of what drives the Ethiopian economy are still attractive, are still strong. So yeah.
Green Legacy Initiative is one of the successful projects of the current leadership. Ethiopia has planted more than 25 billion tree seedlings over the last 5 rainy seasons. This ambitious initiative has not only remained in Ethiopia, rather it has been implemented in neighboring Eastern African nations. Ethiopian government has sent reasonable numbers of tree seedlings to neighboring nations where drought heat became a burning problem. Experts and commentators have appreciated the outcome of the reforms despite the challenge. Homegrown economic reform agenda is a very promising initiative that aimed at transforming Ethiopia to a middle-income nation.
Homegrown economic reform program was well designed, and it would address the previous programs that we had. We had what you call the SDPRP, which is modeled under the PRSP of the World Bank program. PRSP is a poverty reduction policy paper, and the SDPRP was a sustainable development and poverty reduction program for 5 years. Then we had the PASDEP, which was the poverty reduction and sustainable development program again. After that, we had the growth and transformation plan in 2 phases. So the Homegrown economic reform program focused on the potential of increasing capacity within the country in terms of productivity, in terms of services, in terms of import substitution, and in terms of export promotion. So it was well designed, but as you know, we had several major issues concerning the economy. One is the COVID pandemic. The second one is the kind of unsettled situation within the country between the different political groups. The third one is the Ukraine war. So all these have contributed to making the Homegrown reform economic program more difficult to achieve. And therefore, of course, this is a 10-year plan that the government has, and it could be remodeled any time. But the challenges that we had, we need to take into them serious account. For example, let's talk about inflation is global. The United States, in fact, the Federal Reserve in the US is raising interest rates to a point where some banks have failed already. The Silicon Valley Bank has failed. The Credit Suisse in Switzerland has failed. So there is a global economic transition in which it's become more difficult for governments to deliver on their promises. The second thing, of course, one important challenge is corruption in our country. I've heard the Auditor General of the federal government reporting to the House of Representatives, saying that billions have been unaccounted for in the budget of the country. So these 4 elements have been very difficult in terms of achieving the goals of the Homegrown economic reform program. Moreover, they have resulted in major economic crisis like inflation, where it has become several digits now, and also the kind of erosion of the monetary policy management in the country. So otherwise, I think the document was a good document. It should have been a panacea for Ethiopia's economic problems, especially in terms of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals that was agreed upon in the United Nations. And by 2030, we should be able to reach most of the goals that we have. We have done that with the Millennium Development Goals. Ethiopia has done very well with the Millennium Development Goals. So I still have a lot of hope that this could be achieved, given the fact that we can control corruption and we can bring peace and stability into the country.
Mechanizing the agriculture sector and introducing the wheat cluster, creating value chains and market linkage among us farmers and traders is so overwhelming.
A lot of reforms have taken place. Financial service sector is one of the big ones, for example. Now foreign banks are allowed. It's one of the few countries in the world that did not allow foreign banks. Now it's open. A new capital markets, the stock market, the bond market will launch sometime next year in 2024. These are big. The telecom sector, which was a monopoly for 126 years, was opened up in the last 3 years. These are big, what I call mega changes that have taken place. So you will see the benefits of these things over the next several years. Okay? For example, telecom will give a huge boost to the ICT sector, to the banking sector, to every sector in the economy. Okay? So these are big steps. Agriculture, which is the foundation of the Ethiopian economy still, is now we're starting to see transformation. For example, Ethiopia has stopped importing wheat. This is a major milestone. Yes, it's early days, but these are markers that we're starting to put to see that we're on the right path. Okay? However, as I said, if I were to talk about challenges that need to be addressed, as I mentioned earlier, inflation will be at the top of the agenda. It affects all 127 million Ethiopians, 120 plus million Ethiopians. That needs to be addressed. So structural changes to the inflation issue. For example, the demand and supply. Demand far outstrips supply. And this has been known for many, many years. We still haven't addressed it. Import substitution. Okay? We import a whole lot of items unnecessarily. So we need to build our domestic capacity to produce. We can't depend.
Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, though the country is staggering with mismatch between GDP growth and the aggregate population.
To me, speaking from the business side of it, from the financial, sovereignty, of economic sovereignty is key. Not just one element is protecting our borders, our security, that's really critical. But at the same time, to talk about our own sovereignty, we need to own our own. So we need to produce stuff here. We need to stop cutting. We need to cut back what we import. So we have to produce a strategy. We have to have a strategy that says import substitution is now beyond discussion. It's now implementation. What do we need to do to build a strong Ethiopian private sector? The other thing you raised, which is very valid, is now we're shifting from a state-led economy, which delivered those results in the early days. Now we're migrating to a private sector-led economy, okay? Or at least where the private sector has a very significant role in transformation. By the way, we've seen this in South Korea. We've seen this in China when they pivoted. China went from a state-led economy in the early days to now where they have big companies like Huawei, Alibaba, private companies. I think Ethiopia is also pivoting towards that, where we build big Ethiopian companies, entrepreneurial culture. That's some of the things we need to address. But we need, for this to happen, our educational system has to be world-class, has to be reformed. We also, the result recently where the passing rate was abominable, right? I mean, that needs to be fixed. So if we're going to have a transformed economy, because you were also asking me what are some of the challenges we need to address, right? That was the gist of your question. Education is the key. We need to focus on quality education, producing world-class talent so that they can deliver a prosperous Ethiopia. And I think those are just some of the things. But
when Prime Minister Abiy came to power, he promised us a lot of things. One is, of course, to reform the financial management of the country. For example, one is the establishment of credit and capital markets. The second thing is the introduction of foreign banking into Ethiopia, and also to overhaul the financial regulatory environment. Similarly, telecom was another candidate in terms of doing this. On the telecom, I think we've done fairly well, where Safaricom is now joining the market, and also the fact that now digital transfer of currencies in this country would ensure to a high degree what you call inclusive growth. So, but the problem is, I see some kind of resistance towards the coming of foreign capital into this country. You know, most investors don't come with their dollars stuck in their front pocket. They would like to have banks that can provide loans here, banks that have relationships to international banks, banks that can produce billions. Then, you know, we can have this twin development of our agriculture and industry through intensive foreign capital, where our exports would be promoted to a point where we can pay our debt, we can pay for our imports.
GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance. When it's completed, I don't know when it is, maybe next year. It's already, by the way, Ethiopia is already starting exporting electricity. So that generates hard currency, okay? The roads that interconnect Ethiopia to our neighboring countries, whether it's Sudan or Kenya, they enhance our trading capacity with these countries. As you know, we're building a lot of manufacturing. We don't only export them to Europe and the US and other parts, but we can also export them to our neighboring countries. So these prioritized mega projects, they need to be finished, okay? Beyond that, maybe through this new program that they've started called PPP, Public-Private Partnership, offload a lot of this to the private sector. In partnership with the government, housing. And that's one thing, by the way, I should have mentioned in the beginning, you know. When we're talking about the growth of Ethiopia, when we're adding 3 million people to our population every single year net, and we have a 4% annual increase of urbanization, because today we're about 20% urbanized, 80% rural. In the next 20 years, it will be 40% urbanization. So we need to make sure that we have what I call smart cities, create. Addis Ababa, by and large, is developed. It's very difficult to transform Addis in a short period of time. It is being done and it will be done, but let's learn from what we did right in Addis and what went wrong with Addis. Addis started from a small village, became a big city. But we now have an opportunity where the other 100 million plus Ethiopians live, which is outside of Addis. So let's make sure we build smart cities. Smart cities generate they contribute hugely to the GDP if you manage them. From rolling out broadbands to every house, to the water sanitation system. Addis Ababa was being built as we went along, you know, as for the last 100 years. It's only recently it even had a master plan. So these are just both, as I said, challenges we have to manage, but also opportunities. So if you have 10 Addises throughout Ethiopia, every region, for example, every regional capital city has a smart city, but large. Can you imagine what transformational that would be? So urbanization needs to be managed very smartly. So going back to my final point, though, is the future prospects of the Ethiopian economy. I continue to believe, honestly, that it's bright. A lot of work is needed, yes. And then, so what fundamentals means The demographics is in our favor. Okay, I saw the population data for Japan for 2022 just came out. It decreased. The Japanese population declined. The Italian population declining. A lot of Western countries, their population is declining. So they have the wrong demographics. Aging population with few young people. We have just the opposite. So if we invest in our people, manage it, including education, the point that I raised really early, because our biggest asset is our people. Okay? So if we get this right, I don't see why we can't grow by 10, 11, 12%. China grew by double digits for 40 years. 40 years. So why can't we? We can. So these are final point on FDI. Okay? For several years, Ethiopia had been amongst the top 5 recipients of foreign direct investment in Africa. If you look at the UNCTAD report that's published every year, it's amongst the top 5. Sometimes number 2, number 3. Even last year, it was amongst the top 5. But we are the 3rd largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. We got to do better in terms of the volume and the quality of FDI we bring into Ethiopia. So Africa as a whole, by the way, doesn't get its fair share. Out of last year, Africa as a whole, 54 countries got 50 billion. Okay? So Ethiopia getting 3-4 billion is getting more than its fair share compared to that. However, in my view, when we get everything right, our policies, our strategies, our engagement globally, in terms of the economic engagement globally goes smoothly, there's no reason we can't pull in 10 billion a year, 12 billion a year. Okay? So we need a lot of hard work because there's a lot of competition around the world for FDI. We can't just fold our hands and we think it will fall on our laps. There's a lot of work from policies to branding Ethiopia. Rebranding actually of Ethiopia is really needed. So when we get it, very often, but I'm also realistic to say there are challenges. As I mentioned earlier, we need to make sure we address those challenges. But overall, as always, I'm extremely optimistic about Ethiopia's economic future.